Good afternoon. We are back. Pardon me. Um, I apologize in advance if I'm a little hard to understand today. Um, they say it's good for families to share with one another. Sometimes I have to disagree with that. Um, our littlest one got sick last week, and well, he shared, and I'd rather he didn't. I've been sounding like this since Saturday. Some things are pretty tough. And one of those tough things is when you have to preach and you sound like you're trying to become a Barry White impersonator, and a very bad one at that. But anyhow, we are here today. Hopefully I won't be too hard to understand. We are continuing with our journey through Matthew, getting to a lot of interesting things, and today we're going to kick off and pretty much stay with the the call of Matthew himself. Very interesting thing, and before I forget, since it is uh, October 31st, all blessed uh, All Saints Day Eve to everyone, or in modern parlance, Hallows Eve. Uh, uh, Of course, for us in the Lutheran Church, this is a major day because it is our festival of the Reformation, where we remember the liberation of the gospel from the abuses that have been heaped upon it over the centuries. And all this began when a lowly German monk walked up quite unnoticed and nailed 95 questions on the door at the Church of Wittenberg, calling into debate some of the practices that were happening during that time. And boy, did he underestimate the firestorm he would kick off. But hey, we get to benefit from that firestorm because we have the gospel. And it's because of the work that happened during that time, those attempts to reform, that we can go back and we can look and we can see the Word of God. So, very much an important day for us. But anyhow, on to Matthew 9, and we're picking up with verse 9, and we're going to go through 13 today. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners." So, here we are. We're in this passage. We have Jesus calling another disciple to follow him, one who would be one of the inner circle, the 12 apostles. Pardon me. And you would think, right? This is Matthew's gospel. This is his time, this moment to shine. That there would be this great and grand story revolving around Matthew and his call, and Matthew going, "Hey, look, this happened to me." But what we have is a very basic account, and one that actually very much parallels the accounts that happened earlier in the gospel when Jesus was calling the men from the side of the lake, where he comes up to him and he says, "Follow me." And well, that they follow him. Really, this does go to emphasize the authority of Jesus and about how it is about him, not so much about Matthew himself. I mean, this is a pivotal moment for Matthew, but it never really revolves around him. It just happens to be he's there. Jesus comes up to him and says, "Follow me," and Matthew follows him. It's very, very plain, very straightforward, and really rather Jesus focused rather than Matthew focused. Um, so we have this passage right here. And one of the things that it can illustrate for us, particularly for today, is that discipleship begins only when Jesus calls. And it's not something that you can get up and decide to do on your own. This is something that Jesus is going to be doing for you. That it is his call to you. That it is his work, his authority expressed for you. And for us today, we could sit around and go, well, I don't know if Jesus is calling me. I don't feel anything. And I haven't had him show up at my door saying, hey, come follow me. Or barring that, having one of those moments where we have this blinding white light that knocks us, well, not off our horse, because not many people ride horses, knocks us out of our car or off our motorcycle. Nobody really experiences that today. So, how and when does Jesus call us? That answer is pretty simple. That's for many of us is, I mean, Jesus' call is our baptism, where we are called to the cross, where we are brought and united to Jesus in his cross, in his death and his resurrection. For us, for many of us, that is our call to discipleship. Remember, when we get to the end of Matthew, we are going to hear Jesus say, the way you make disciples is by means of baptizing them. So discipleship for many of us begins with our baptism. That's our call. Um, and yes, I'm not ignoring the folks who heard the gospel proclaimed and received it, and faith was created that way. I'm not ignoring them. I'm just with this for I'm just going with baptism because it is definitely an objective call. It's hard to deny the water that's pouring over your head. So that's why I'm focusing here. And also because for a lot of people who, particularly those who have grown up in the church, you know, and baptism's kind of how we got started. So, all right. So, Jesus calls Matthew, and we get an illustration of when discipleship begins. Now, the question we have to ask is why Matthew? Uh, what is there about Matthew? We can ask the same question about the other disciples who were called by Jesus, who were named out. Why them? And particularly, why a tax collector? You would think Jesus would be a little bit better in the PR department, being all God and such, that he would be smart enough to realize that if you want to win the people over, you don't have one of your chief people being a tax collector. Who likes the IRS agent? I'm sorry, IRS agents, I don't mean to be insulting, but let's face it, the IRS is not popular, particularly come April 15th, or for those of us who have to do the estimated taxes when those dates come around too. So, uh, but anyhow, so why a tax collector? What does this say about Jesus and his ministry? These have implications. But I think to be able to understand this, to really approach this, we've got to ask a couple of questions. And the first of it is, who are the tax collectors? Because if we're going to understand the implications of calling a tax collector, we got to ask that question. Who is a tax collector? And this is a little bit more complicated than people tend to try and make out. because we go with the simple modern assumption, well, nobody likes the IRS agents, so nobody's going to like the tax collectors. There's other things that go along with it. Um, Now, to be fair, I'm going to go ahead and throw this caveat out there. A lot of what we actually know about tax collection practices during that time uh, comes from Egypt. There have been some first century papyri that have been found in Egypt that described the practices of collecting taxes in Roman Egypt, and when Rome ruled over Egypt. If you don't know your history, yes, Rome at one point controlled Egypt. So um, during that time, of course, they were collecting taxes for Rome. And, well, they had to lay out and describe how things were supposed to happen. And and it just so happens there was an archaeological find where they found some of these documents. And so much of what we actually know actually comes from that. And with its proximity to Israel and the assumption that Rome's going to have some pretty consistent uh, tax practices across their empire, and it kind of makes sense to have consistent practices. Um, we can make some inferences about what was happening in first century Israel at the time. So what we know from these documents is there were actually two different major types of tax collectors. The first type was those who would collect what we would call direct taxes. These are taxes on a person's land or their person. So you can think income tax and property tax. Those would be kind of correspondent to these practices in first century Rome. These taxes were generally collected by a government official, somebody who actually was a part of the government, one of their clerks, one of their somebody who was actually, they got their pay from the Roman government. Um, so these were official people, a part of the government, and you could really compare these folks to the IRS agent, because the IRS agent who comes to do your audit and collect whatever taxes you owe, they're an official of the U.S. government. Um, in the same way, the person who came to collect property taxes and taxes on person was an official of the Roman government. Now, on the other side, there was what now you could call indirect taxes, and these were customs and commerce taxes. You could think of import tariffs and sales tax would be some modern equivalents to that. These were collected at, for lack of a better term, toll booths. You could call them tax booths, whatever. And these booths were placed in the commerce areas of towns and along the major trade routes. Um, oh my goodness, my voice is cracking. These particular ones, these were overseen by folks who would bid on them. So these are independent contractors, so to speak. So we have these two different kinds of tax collectors that are happening, and we also have to take into account regions too. It's very popular to think that one of the reasons that tax collectors were looked down upon is that they were considered collaborators. That depends. Uh, we we can we we it is possible that this was happening in Judea and Samaria, where it was the Roman procurator who oversaw the taxes. So it was the Roman official who was overseeing the tax collecting of both the direct and the indirect. So I think Pontius Pilate, this was part of his job as the governor of that region. In those cases, there could be some animosity created because they would see the tax collectors as collaborators, particularly those who were collecting the indirect taxes, because they were the independent contractors, which most likely meant locals. But that may not necessarily always be the case, uh, particularly when we take into account where this particular event is happening, which is in the region of Galilee. Galilee at the time over was ruled over by Herod Antipas, who was technically a king. Uh, Granted, he ruled at the pleasure of Rome, so though he was a king, he was answerable to a Roman official. But there's a difference between Herod ruling as a king and Pontius Pilate, so to speak, ruling as the Roman governor. Herod's a local. He may not be Jewish, but he is a local. And that's going to color people's thought processes to some extent. Now, granted, Herod Antipas wasn't exactly popular, so, but he still had being a local going for him, as opposed to uh, Pontius Pilate and Quirinius, who's mentioned in Luke, um, who came from Rome. Uh, yeah, that would count against him. So, it's hard to say in the end that the animosity that we see in the Gospels is largely due to them being collaborators. There could be some of that going on here, but most likely the animosity is due to simple greed and dishonesty. And I remember that the tax collectors, particularly those who gathered the indirect taxes, were independent contractors. And the way that this would work is that they would bid on regions that they would be allowed to collect their taxes. And of course, Rome being smart, they would get whoever's the highest bidder. And so, hey, when you're trying to outbid somebody, uh, you got a lot of money on the line, particularly if you win. I So you're trying as an independent contractor to recoup that bid, and at the same time, you got to make a living. And really, it was a system that did encourage greed and practices that were more favorable to getting back your money and making a profit at the same time. So, likelihood, most of the animosity that is existing towards tax collectors and part of why they will be always thrown in with the sinners is the fact that, well, they had a reputation for being greedy and dishonest in their dealings. And a lot of that came out because of the fact that they were attempting to recoup what they had bid on winning the region. So they're trying to make a bunch of money. A prime example of one of these kind of tax collectors is wee little Zacchaeus, who many of us probably know from that little silly ditty that we teach Sunday school kids. Zacchaeus, he was the chief tax collector in the region of Jericho. So he was in charge of all those toll booths, and he's going to have business practices that are going to make sure he can continue to recoup what he bid to keep that region and to, well, make him lots of money. So And that's what we have going on here. Now, that's not to say Matthew was of that sort. There's not a lot of detail that's given about what kind of tax collector that Matthew is. So, there's all sorts of things that could go in there. The fact that he's a Levite, that could suggest that his job isn't for collecting taxes for Herod, so to speak, maybe for the temple. That's not gone into. What we know is he was a collector of taxes and that he happened to be in a booth at that time. The fact that he was in a booth suggests that likelihood Matthew was kind of minor as far as tax collectors go. Because seriously, the higher ups, they're not going to be out dealing with the people. They're going to have underlings who are going to be collecting the taxes. So the likelihood is that Matthew is a minor tax collecting official. Chances are still kind of good that he was one of the independent contractors, or at least worked for one of the independent contractors. So that is a possibility that's going on here, particularly with him being labeled as a tax collector in the upcoming story. So chances are pretty good that he's one of the ones collecting the indirect taxes, and that it happened to be he was in the marketplace. Jesus was walking by and calls him. So, okay, moving on to our next question. Who are the sinners? This is important to understand because it really does drive a lot of the understanding of what's going on here. So just as it's important to understand who tax collectors are, we need to understand who the sinners are. It used to be pretty popular thought that the Pharisees thought everybody who wasn't one of them was a sinner. That had some flaws. Namely, why did people think they were think a lot of them. Why were they popular amongst the people? I mean, are you going to really like somebody who thinks you're scum of the earth because you don't wash your hands in the right way? Uh, are you going to like that? Probably not. Seriously, I don't like it. There's no reason for me to assume they would like it, unless they're like really weird. But anyhow, there's no accounting for people. But still, that it does. The idea that Pharisees thought everybody who wasn't a Pharisee is a sinner just does, and scum of the earth just doesn't fit. Um, Also, what calls into question some of this is the fact that Matthew uses the phrase himself. So it's not just the Pharisees who are saying, why does, it's not only the Pharisees using this phrase, it's also Matthew himself. Um, because Matthew states, and behold, he was reclining with tax collectors and sinners. And then he says, and the Pharisees say, why does your master sit with tax collectors and sinners? Um, and so at this point, we could assume that Matthew understands that everybody's a sinner, but that still doesn't account for the Pharisees who likely, because they're well thought of, didn't consider everybody, to be sinners, the other. So what does it mean about sinners? Likely what we have here, taking into account both viewpoints, is likely what we have is folks who are a little bit more publicly flagrant about their sins. Say prostitutes, maybe, uh, or any other number of flagrant activities. Seriously, when does it have to look too far to see examples of that in our day? Just stand in line at the grocery store. There's plenty of examples. So, but likely what we're highlighting here is um, the more you know, people public who are more public about their sin. So, not in the repentant type, but let's flaunt. Pardon me. Let's flaunt it. So likely what we got going on here is we have a collection of folks who are the independent contractors and other folks who uh, in, who would probably be considered the person you don't want to bring home to meet mom and dad. So um, this cynical Gen Xer of me wants to crack a politician joke right now, but I will refrain. Uh, but anyhow, so this brings us to our next part with the whole idea of table fellowship. All right, because that's the question that the Pharisees ask. Why does your teacher hang out and eat with tax collectors and sinners? Um, there is some credence to the idea that table fellowship has some significance, that getting together and eating together would suggest a bit of an intimate bond. And this isn't necessarily 100% true every single time, but there is something to it. And if you take into account the Pharisees' insistence on purity, uh, who you hang out with at dinner is going to be intensified, because with the Pharisees, everything had to be ritually pure. And, well, flagrant, unrepentant sinners are not exactly what you would call ritually pure. And so the idea of sharing the table with them would be kind of, yeah, not so well. And also, there's a whole host of practices that go along with a table fellowship. And so there's all sorts of things that go along with it. And how you're treated at a meal can indicate your level of acceptance. This is illustrated in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus has been invited to eat at the Pharisee named Simon's table. And when this lady comes in and she washes his feet and does these really nice things, I, I, Simon makes the comment, well, if he was really, who he says he is, he would know who this woman is. And Jesus kind of calls Simon to the floor. He's like, look, she's bathed my feet with her tears and dried my feet with her hair, and you didn't even bother to show the basics of hospitality to me. Um, Basically, what happened is Simon treated Jesus as somebody of a lower status level than he is. That Jesus was there kind of on a provisional basis. This is like the trial membership given to people at exclusive clubs. Are you really good enough to be part of our club? So uh, there, how you treat people at um, the dinner table was going to be a sign of how you accepted them and what kind of status people had. And if Jesus is entreating and fellowshipping with people, and they're treating him of high status, they're showing great deals of acceptance. So that could rub some Pharisees a little raw. And also, it's important to note that table fellowship with Jesus is kind of a transformational event. Um, and this comes out in this particular passage, right there at the end, where Jesus goes, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the unhealthy, it's the sick. I mean, some would say maybe, I need a doctor right now. But Jesus came to call sinners. And here he is at dinner, and he's calling sinners. Tax collectors and sinners have been gathered to him. Now, there's no indication how he was received by everybody, but the fact of the matter is he was there to call them. And then when you throw in some of the other things that are happening, particularly in the other Gospels, we get a unique picture of table fellowship with Jesus. And in Luke, he just absolutely throws out all notions of relative status when he rebukes the people for fighting for the best seat at the table, when really it's the host who's going to determine who gets the best seat. And this, for us, this can't help but bring us, particularly with the way Jesus is going to be using feasting and dinner talk to illustrate the reign of heaven. We cannot help but to end up hearing the idea that, this is about him, not us, so to speak, and our status. And this is about him elevating us to a status. So we get this with him eating with tax collectors and sinners, this very radically inclusive view of table fellowship with him. And at the same time, we also have a very radically exclusive table fellowship, because everything is dependent on him. And everybody who rejects this, pardon me, is excluded from the table. So, and this is all happening right here and being drawn together. We can't ignore it, particularly within the context of Matthew, as the ideas of the feast are developed. And with the blanket statement, he came to call sinners. That's who he came for. Of course, I always found the great irony is he goes, I didn't come to call the righteous, but I came to call the sinners. And who are some of the people that he keeps talking to? The Pharisees. They don't recognize that he's including them in that label of sinners. Right? I always just find that quite ironic. But the heart of the point is, this call of Matthew ends up being a story of Jesus and his mission, where he is calling people out of their sin into his table fellowship. And if you can't start to see communion in this kind of language, take some time, think about what communion is, particularly what Jesus says communion is. And we start to see how his brand of table fellowship plays out for us sinners. And with that, we're going to call it quits for today. Hopefully I'll have enough voice to talk to my confirmads later this evening. We're going to have some fun, and with it being Halloween and everything, I thought it'd be nice to them and do pizza parties and such like that. But we're going to still talk some really important stuff, and hopefully I have enough voice to tell them. So until then, God bless, and see you guys next week.